Have you ever seen a man so powerful that even his silence used to control a room? Now sitting helpless, unable to lift a single spoon? The marble dining hall of Victor Hale's estate stretched wide and immaculate, polished floors reflecting the warm glow of imported Italian chandeliers. A space designed to command respect, not pity. And yet at the head of the 20-foot table sat a man who inspired both. Victor Hale himself, once the most feared name across 3 states, a man whose decisions moved millions of dollars and silenced entire rooms with a glance, now confined to a custom-built wheelchair, his tailored charcoal suit, still perfectly fitted, his posture still upright, his presence still heavy. But his body no longer obeyed him, and in front of him, placed with precision as always, was a simple bowl of soup, steam rising slowly into the quiet air, untouched, cooling second by second while around him stood men who would have once risked their lives at a single command. Men in dark suits with earpieces and rigid discipline, a house manager with years of loyalty etched into his posture, and yet not one of them stepped forward, not one of them dared to reach for the spoon. Not because they didn't notice, not because they didn't understand, but because they remembered exactly who Victor Hale used to be, a man who had built his empire on control so absolute that even a misplaced gesture could be seen as disrespect, and in that memory lived a fear so deeply rooted it had outlasted his strength. So now they stood there, still as statues, pretending to review documents, pretending to monitor security feeds, pretending the untouched meal in front of their boss did not exist, while Victor's eyes, sharp and unyielding, tracked everything, every hesitation, every avoided glance, every quiet betrayal disguised as obedience. And though his fingers rested motionless on the armrest, though his jaw remained set in that same composed line, there was something new beneath it all, something no one in that room dared to acknowledge, a flicker of awareness that the power he once held had not disappeared. It had simply changed shape, becoming a cage built from the very fear that once protected him. And across the room, half hidden behind the doorway leading to the kitchen, a small figure stood watching, unnoticed by everyone except the silence itself. A little girl no older than 6, Amara Brooks, her wide eyes fixed not on the suits, not on the guards, not on the wealth surrounding her, but on the bowl of soup slowly losing its warmth, because while the adults in that room saw a legend, a reputation, a danger too great to approach, she saw something far simpler, something no one else seemed willing to admit. She saw a man who hadn't eaten, and in that quiet moment, without understanding the rules that govern this world, without knowing the weight of the name Victor Hale, she took a small step forward, her sneakers barely making a sound against the polished floor, while behind her, her mother's voice whispered a warning she didn't fully understand, and ahead of her, the most powerful man in the room sat completely still, watching, as if the entire world had just shifted by the smallest, most dangerous movement imaginable. What kind of power leaves a man surrounded by people, and still completely alone? The low murmur of voices returned to the dining hall as if nothing had shifted, as if the small movement from the doorway had gone unnoticed, but beneath the surface, tension tightened like a wire pulled too far, because Victor Hale had seen her. His eyes locked onto the small figure stepping cautiously across the polished marble, her reflection trailing beneath her like a question no one dared answer, and around the table, subtle reactions rippled through the men who knew better than to show. Fear, shoulders stiffening, glances flickering, hands pausing mid-motion over documents that suddenly didn't matter, because this wasn't supposed to happen. Not in this house. Not in this room where every movement had once been calculated, controlled, approved, and yet Amara Brooks kept walking, her steps small but steady, her gaze never leaving the bowl in front of Victor, as if the entire room, the wealth, the danger, the unspoken rules, simply didn't exist to her, and behind her, her mother's voice came sharper now, urgent but still hushed. "Amara, come back here." But the words felt distant, like background noise to a decision already made, because in Amara's world, things were simpler, people ate when they were hungry, and if they couldn't, someone helped them, and that was all there was to it, while at the table, one of the senior men cleared his throat softly, leaning just slightly toward another, whispering under his breath, "Stop her." But the response came just as quietly, tight with something dangerously close to panic. "You stop her," and neither moved, because stepping in now meant choosing a side, risking a reaction they couldn't predict, and unpredictability was the one thing no one in Victor Hale's world had ever survived comfortably. So they did nothing, The same thing they had done when the soup was placed in front of him, the same thing they had done when his fingers failed to move, and Victor watched it all, every hesitation, every silent calculation, every excuse disguised as loyalty, and for a brief second, something colder than anger passed through his expression, something sharper, because he understood exactly what was happening. Understood that the empire he built had trained these men so well that they no longer knew how to act without permission. And now, when he needed the smallest human gesture, they were incapable of giving it. And then Amara reached the table, close enough now that the difference between them felt almost unreal, her small frame barely rising above the edge, her fingers gripping the wood as she pulled herself up onto the chair beside him, the legs scraping softly against the floor in a sound that echoed louder than it should have. And that was when the room truly shifted, because now there was no pretending this wasn't happening, no ignoring the line that had just been crossed, and still Victor did not speak. His gaze lowering slowly to meet hers, studying her the way he had studied rivals, partners, threats, but there was no calculation in her eyes, no fear, no awareness of the weight behind his name, just a quiet certainty that felt almost unsettling in its simplicity. And as her small hand moved toward the spoon, fingers wrapping around it with visible effort, the man who once controlled everything realized something he had never had to face before. Not what would happen if someone defied him, but what would happen if someone didn't even know they were supposed to. What happens when the most dangerous man in the room is no longer the one in control, but the one being watched? The spoon trembled slightly in Amara Brooks's small hand, the metal catching the warm light as she struggled to lift it steadily, her fingers adjusting instinctively, learning the weight as if this moment mattered more than anything else around her. And for Victor Hale it did, because in all his years, decades of calculated decisions, controlled conversations, and silent authority, no one had ever approached him like this, not without permission, not without fear, not without understanding exactly who he was. And yet here she stood, a child who didn't hesitate, didn't flinch, didn't wait for approval that had once dictated every movement in this room. And as the spoon hovered just inches from his face, time seemed to slow, stretching thin across the silence, while around them, the men who once thrived under his command felt something shift that they couldn't name, something far more unsettling than danger, because danger they understood. But this was something else entirely. Something that stripped away the structure they relied on, and one of the guards near the wall instinctively stepped forward before stopping himself mid-motion, his training clashing with uncertainty, his eyes flicking toward Victor for a signal that never came, because Victor did not react, not yet. His gaze fixed on the girl in front of him, studying her the way he had once studied contracts, threats, alliances, searching for intention, for motive, for any sign that this was anything other than what it appeared to be. But there was nothing there except quiet determination, and it unsettled him more than any rival ever had, because he realized something in that moment that cut deeper than any loss of control. This child did not recognize his power, which meant she could not be influenced by it, could not be intimidated by it, could not be controlled by it, and for the first time in years, Victor Hale faced someone who existed completely outside the system he had built, and that realization pressed against him in a way his immobile body could not express. His jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as old instincts rose, the ingrained expectation that this breach would be corrected, that boundaries would be reestablished, that order would return, but nothing happened, because no one dared intervene, and the responsibility, if there even was one, rested solely with him. And Amara, unaware of the weight of that decision, tilted her head slightly, her voice soft but certain as she spoke the simplest truth in the room. "It's getting cold." And those 3 words landed heavier than any command Victor had ever given, because they carried no fear, no agenda, no hidden meaning, just an observation that no one else had been willing to voice. And for a brief second, something flickered behind his eyes, something that hadn't been seen in years, not by his men, not by his enemies, not even by himself, a memory perhaps, or a recognition buried too deep to fully surface. And the room held its breath without realizing it, waiting not for an outburst, not for a reaction, but for a decision that would redefine everything they thought they knew about the man sitting at the head of that table. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Victor Hale made the smallest movement he could still control. He didn't turn away. What if the most powerful decision a man could make was simply to accept help? The spoon remained suspended in the air, held by Amara Brooks's small, steady hand, the steam from the soup now barely visible as the warmth faded, and in that fragile space between action and consequence, every eye in the room fixed on Victor Hale, waiting for the reaction they had been conditioned to expect, the sharp correction, the silent dismissal, the invisible line being redrawn, but it never came, because Victor did something none of them were prepared for. He hesitated, not out of weakness, but out of something far more unfamiliar, something that didn't fit into the structure of power he had spent a lifetime perfecting, and as he looked at the child in front of him, really looked this time, he saw details that had nothing to do with threat or status, the slight tension in her fingers as she held the spoon, the quiet patience in her posture, the complete absence of fear in her expression, and it disarmed him in a way no rival ever had, because fear had always been the language of his world, the currency that bought loyalty, silence, obedience, but here, in this moment, that currency meant nothing, and for the first time, Victor realized that everything he had built, every rule, every expectation, every invisible boundary, had created a world where no one knew how to act without being told, where even kindness required permission, and as that realization settled in, something deeper began to shift, something quieter but far more profound, because beneath the layers of control, beneath the reputation and the years of calculated distance, there was a memory he hadn't allowed himself to revisit, a voice softer than the ones that filled his daily life, a presence that didn't fear him, didn't negotiate with him, didn't measure her words carefully before speaking, and for a brief second, it felt close enough to touch, close enough to hear again, and his chest tightened. Not visibly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but enough that the moment stretched further, heavier, until even the men around him began to sense that this was no longer about a simple breach of protocol. This was something else, something they didn't understand and therefore couldn't control, and Amara, unaware of the storm unfolding behind Victor's steady gaze, adjusted her grip slightly, lifting the spoon a little higher, her voice gentle but firm as she spoke again. "You have to eat before it gets cold." And there it was, the simplest instruction, offered without hesitation, without fear, without expectation of consequence, and it landed with a weight that no command ever had, because it wasn't about power, it wasn't about control, it was about something Victor had not experienced in a very long time. Being seen not as a symbol, not as a force, but as a person with a need, and in that recognition, something inside him cracked just enough to let a different kind of decision form, not one calculated for advantage, not one designed to maintain authority, but one that felt almost unfamiliar in its simplicity, and slowly, deliberately Victor Hale parted his lips, not as a sign of surrender, but as the quietest acknowledgement that, for the first time in years, he was willing to let someone help him, and as the spoon moved forward that final inch, the entire room seemed to stop breathing, because in that single motion, everything they believed about power was being rewritten in silence. Can a single memory break a man who never allowed himself to feel? The spoon touched Victor Hale's lips, and for a moment, nothing happened, the world holding its breath as if even time itself was waiting for permission. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he accepted it, the smallest movement of his mouth turning into something far greater than anyone in that room could comprehend, because it wasn't just food he was taking in, it was the collapse of a rule that had governed his entire life. And as the warmth of the soup reached him, something else surfaced, something he had buried so deeply that even he had forgotten how sharp it could feel. A memory not of power, not of control, but of a quiet afternoon years ago, sunlight spilling across a kitchen counter, a small voice laughing, insisting that he sit still while she tried to feed him with hands too small to manage the spoon properly. Her giggles filling the space where silence now ruled, and for the first time since that day, Victor didn't see the dining hall, didn't see the men around him, didn't feel the weight of his name pressing down on every second. He saw her, his daughter, the one person who had never been afraid of him, the one person who had spoken to him the same way this child did now, without hesitation, without calculation, without fear, and the realization hit him harder than any confrontation ever had, because he understood in that instant what had truly been lost, not just her, but the version of himself that existed when someone could approach him, without needing permission, and the room around him shifted again, though no one could name why, because what they were witnessing wasn't just a man eating. It was a man remembering something he had spent years refusing to acknowledge, and Amara Brooks, unaware of the storm unfolding behind Victor's steady gaze, smiled slightly as she steadied the spoon again, her small voice carrying that same quiet certainty. "See, it's not hard." And those words, simple and unguarded, landed with a weight that none of the men in that room could replicate, because they had spent years speaking carefully, measuring every word, ensuring every sentence aligned with expectation, while this child spoke the truth without thinking about consequence. And Victor felt it, the difference, the contrast between a world built on fear and a moment built on something entirely different, something he no longer had a name for. And as the second spoonful rose, the men around the table began to exchange glances they couldn't quite hide, subtle, uncertain, because they were witnessing something that did not fit into any structure they understood, something that could not be controlled or predicted. And for the first time since Victor Hale had built his empire, the rules were no longer clear, and that uncertainty spread through the room like a quiet ripple, unsettling, disarming, forcing each of them to confront a truth they had never considered, that the man they feared had never needed protection from them. He had needed something else entirely, something none of them had ever offered. And as Victor swallowed again, his gaze lowering briefly before returning to Amara, there was a shift, small but undeniable, not in his posture, not in his authority, but in the way he saw the world in front of him, because he realized something that no one else in that room had yet understood, something that would change everything. Moving forward, that the only person who had dared to help him was the only person who didn't know she was supposed to be afraid. In a world where power once ruled through silence and fear, a paralyzed mafia boss sits at the head of a grand table, surrounded by men who obey but no longer understand him, until a little black girl quietly breaks every rule by offering the one thing no one else dares: human kindness. This emotional dark romance story explores the fragile line between dominance and vulnerability, where control collapses under the weight of isolation and a single innocent act begins to unravel years of fear-based authority. As the mafia boss confronts a past shaped by loss and emotional distance, the presence of the little black girl becomes a powerful mirror reflecting everything he has buried, making this dark romance not just about power, but about the cost of losing connection and the unexpected paths to redemption. Through cinematic storytelling, intense psychological tension, and deeply human moments, this dark romance reveals how true strength is not found in fear, but in the ability to accept compassion when it is least expected. As the narrative unfolds, viewers are drawn into a gripping dark romance where every glance, every silence, and every small action carries immense emotional weight, culminating in a transformative experience that redefines dignity, trust, and what it truly means to be seen. This dark romance ultimately delivers a powerful message about healing, reminding us that even in the darkest worlds, the smallest act of kindness can change everything. What if the people who swore loyalty to you were never loyal at all, only afraid to move without your permission? The second spoonful had barely left Amara Brooks's hand when a subtle shift rippled through the room. Not loud, not obvious, but enough for Victor Hale to feel it. The tension tightening in shoulders, the quiet recalculation in the eyes of men who had spent years reading danger before it arrived, because now they were witnessing something they could not categorize, something that didn't follow the rules they had built their survival around. And for the first time, Victor wasn't just observing them, he was understanding them, truly understanding what they had become under his rule. Not allies, not protectors, but extensions of a system that had trained them to freeze without instruction. And that realization settled deeper than anything before it, because it carried a truth he could no longer ignore, that the empire he had spent decades perfecting had not created loyalty, it had created hesitation. A silence so complete that even now, when he sat unable to lift his own hand, no one stepped forward to help him, and the weight of that truth pressed against him as Amara lifted the spoon again, her small movements steady, unaffected by the shifting atmosphere, because she wasn't reading the room the way the others were. She wasn't measuring risk or consequence, she was simply continuing what she had started. And as the spoon hovered once more, Victor's gaze shifted, not to her this time, but to the men around the table, his eyes moving slowly, deliberately, meeting each of theirs in turn, and one by one, they looked away, not out of disrespect, but out of something far more revealing, something they could not hide in that moment, because for the first time, the silence in the room wasn't controlled by him. It was exposing them, and Victor saw it clearly now, the difference between fear and respect, between obedience and care, between a system that functioned perfectly and a human need that had been completely ignored. And in that realization, something inside him shifted again, not breaking this time but sharpening, refining into something new, something that carried both clarity and consequence, because he understood that this moment wasn't just about a child feeding him, it was about everything that had led to this, every decision that had shaped the people around him into what they were now, and every absence that had left him alone when it mattered most. And Amara, unaware of the silent reckoning unfolding around her, leaned in slightly, her voice soft but firm as she spoke again. "You didn't eat all day, did you?" And the question landed with a quiet force that cut through everything else, because it was the first time anyone had asked him that. Not today. Not in this room. Not in years. And Victor didn't answer. Not because he couldn't, but because the answer itself felt heavier than the silence that followed. And as he allowed her to feed him once more, his eyes returned to hers, no longer searching for motive, no longer analyzing risk, but recognizing something he had failed to see before, that the smallest presence in the room had just revealed the biggest truth of all, that power without humanity leaves a man surrounded, and still completely alone.